Welcome to this Royal Irish Academy of Music online guest lecture. It's a great pleasure to introduce David Byers, who will be presenting a lecture entitled Welcome to My World, Challenges with Edward Bunting, Harpers, Samuel Wesley and Norman Hay. David Byers is a composer, musicologist, writer and music producer. After initial studies at Queen's University Belfast, he spent 4 years as the Manson Scholar in Composition at London's Royal Academy of Music. Awarded the Art Council of Ireland's Macaulay Fellowship and a Belgian government scholarship in 1972, he studied with Henri Pousser at the Liège Conservatoire. He spent 25 years making a wide variety of music and speech programmes for BBC Radio 3, Radio 4 and Radio Ulster, before being appointed Chief Executive of the Ulster Orchestra for the next 8 years, retiring in 2010. His music covers most genres except opera and includes orchestral commissions from RTE and the BBC. His editions of other composers range across the Baroque, classical and Romantic periods to the 20th century world of Ina Boyle. Byers writes many programme notes and also liner notes for CDs. He was a member of the Arts Council on Corla Aline in the mid-1980s and was a Coulson Governor of the Royal Irish Academy of Music. He has served on many boards, including Wexford Festival Opera and the National Concert Hall, and also on the juries of international competitions. He continues to write and produce chamber and orchestral recordings. His recent book, Gatherings of Irish Harpers 1780 to 1840, was published by Irish Pages Press in 2022. And it's wonderful to welcome David to the Royal Irish Academy of Music today to present this lecture entitled Welcome to My World, Challenges with Edward Bunting, Harpers, Samuel Wesley and Norman Hay. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Denise, for that. I'm trying to hide my blushes now. It's more than a little bit alarming to suggest a title for this talk some months ago and then actually have now to face up to what it was I was intending to achieve. Welcome to my world. I thought I'd share with you some of the problems I encounter and some of the challenges in maybe resolving those issues. A sort of lessons learned, maybe an exercise in therapy for me, and hopefully clues to help others or point them in certain directions. A trigger warning to begin with: be aware of far too much self-centeredness, if that's a thing. Denise has certainly explained where I've come from, where I've been. When I retired in late 2010, I planned to revise my own works, for many were written in a great hurry, digitize them, for many were written before Sibelius became an indispensable part of presenting your own music, and also look for performances, something I couldn't do working for the BBC and the Ulster Orchestra. Life, of course, is never as simple as that. Other things seem to have taken precedence. Before I left the orchestra, we negotiated a move from the Elmwood Hall at Queen's University to the Ulster Hall in the middle of Belfast. That meant the loss of a spacious basement at Elmwood, and I found myself saving many years' worth of concert programmes from the skip. Then, not too long after I retired, they moved the management offices out of the Ulster Hall altogether, another downsizing. I remember driving past the hall's artists' entrance to find a skip overflowing with more paperwork and programmes. I crammed what I could into my car, and now I can boast of a garage full of Ulster Orchestra programmes and some marketing paperwork. Since then, I've added many, many more concert programmes. Yes, I'm a major hoarder. My intention is to record each concert's details in a database and eventually send all the programmes to the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, PRONI. The first 10 years has been delivered to PRONI, and I've added the first 5 years of the database online. More to follow, maybe. The database has expanded to include other orchestras: the BBC Northern Ireland Orchestra, pre-war and post-war, the City of Belfast Orchestra, and others. That's the ambition. Reality is very different. Progress has slowed down to a snail's pace because so many other things have taken over. As Denise said, not just due to continued programmatic for BBC concerts and producing Ulster Orchestra concerts for Radio 3 as a freelancer. One of many other relevant time-consuming tasks was compiling a potted history of the BMS, the Belfast Music Society, formerly the British Music Society. That's available on their website, the BMS. Many of their committee records and programmes survive in the Linnenhall Library in Belfast, but they're incomplete and they're basically uncatalogued. Fortunately, I hope that material like that has been captured by a scheme grandly called the Internet of Musical Things. No, the Internet of Musical Events, Digital Scholarship, Community and the Archiving of Performance, Intermuse for short. The programme brings together universities in York, Swansea, Illinois and the British Library, and the team is combining computer technology, I believe we're talking artificial intelligence here to process speech and text, along with harvesting data from concert programmes, correspondence, posters and other ephemera. Intermuse describes it all as this, let me quote, "The richness of the resulting data will offer unprecedented opportunities to collect, analyse and visualise information about musical events and how they've shaped community life over the past century. The data will be used to form an open access digital archive that can be linked with existing digital portals and will be open and accessible to all." It sounds ideal in so many ways, but will surely only be as good as the quantity and the completeness of the materials provided. And if umpteen programmes and concert listings are missing, well, it's sad how little regard there seems to be out there for maintaining our music archives as a vital resource for future researchers, for accurate historical recording, for heritage, for future programme planning. Do forgive my sweeping generalisations, which may or may not apply outside the North. A major problem, of course, is the storage space that downsized arts organisations actually have nowadays. Not many have spare garages, I suppose. It represents a cost they can't afford. Two specific aspects of the Intermuse project stand out for me, both very desirable. One is the wish to match the music events to the community, to the social history of the period. For my orchestral database, I began to add in details of each week's bombings and shootings from 1969 onwards. It added a whole new context, a whole new dimension, but it all took so much longer than I reckoned. I'll have to forgo that, I just have to give all that up to fill out the concert's information, get it down onto the database. The second desirable aspect of Intermuse is its proposed accessibility, free access on the internet. A great idea, but probably not without its staffing and maintenance challenges. My orchestra's page, along with the Irish composers I've dealt with, and I'll come to some of those later, they generate so many email questions and requests from people, all requiring detailed answers, all taking quite a lot of time. Nonetheless, where would you be without the internet? If you suspect you've got something wrong with yourself, medically speaking, the answer might be found by consulting Dr. Google. I was reading a review in a newspaper just last Sunday, a review of a new book on the history of hypochondria, and this line caught my attention, quote, "The internet is the most expansive and spacious playground that hypochondria has ever had." That's all so true, equally so for music research. Through important leads from digitised newspapers, uploaded theses, books made available in whole, often through the Internet Archive or in small parts, or by ordering cheap second-hand copies. The one thing I value very much about research on the internet is the fact there's so many sideways steps you can take. And I recommend that. I've learned so much from simply going down those highways and byways. Obviously, if you've got a deadline of work to deliver, you've got to ignore some of that. But it's exploring those side roads that really have been so profitable in delivering extra material. When I set about writing my wee tome about gatherings of Irish harpers, 1780 to 1840, I was really grateful to discover a fine treasure trove published in Finland just 3 years ago, the letters of Mary Ann McCracken by Catherine Bronwyn McWilliams. Even better, it was all online. Mary Ann was an amazingly long-lived woman, brother of short-lived Henry Joy McCracken, one of the founders of the United Irishmen, who was hanged for his leading role in the 1798 uprising. Mary Ann was a campaigner for the abolition of slavery a social reformer, educator and businesswoman. A long overdue statue to her was unveiled a few weeks ago in the grounds of Belfast City Hall. Edward Bunting, the transcriber of the tunes played by the harpers at the 1792 Belfast gathering, lived in the McCracken household for 35 years before his marriage and eventual removal to Dublin. Mary Ann's letters to Bunting, along with one or two from her brothers, add to our knowledge about Bunting's travels and his costs of production for the second of his 3 volumes. There are still many corners of Bunting's life that need to be explored. He travelled to Europe, certainly to Paris, Belgium and Holland between 1815 and 1817, but so far I failed to find any reference anywhere about those travels, apart from the 1 or 2 tales he told George Petrie, and George Petrie's portrait in the Dublin University magazine of 1847 is a key source for what we know about Bunting. Petrie states that Bunting made friends with many of the most eminent musicians, whom he no less delighted by the beauty of the Irish airs which he played for them. He surprised them by the assurance which he gravely gave that the refined harmonies with which he accompanied them were equally Irish and contemporaneous with the airs themselves. "Match me that," said Bunting proudly to astonished Frenchmen, as, slapping his thigh to suit the action to the word, he rose from the pianoforte after delighting them with the performance of one of his finest airs. Surely there's at least one reference somewhere in a French newspaper about the Irishman entertaining people with those Irish airs. There's a challenge for someone. By good fortune, it was thanks to searching Belfast newspapers of the period that I found a reference to Stephen White, the organ builder who Bunting persuaded to set up in Belfast for a few years, building the new organ for Bunting's church in 1806, and most likely the first organ in the Chapel of Ease, St George's Church in Belfast. He also built harps in 1808 and 1809 for the Belfast Harp Society at 10 guineas each. The minutes of the Harp Society states, "Resolved that the Secretary write to the Secretary of the Dublin Harp Society to inform him that harps of superior tone can be procured here." Wouldn't you know? After Bunting married in 1819, he moved to Dublin and had a varied career. 2 years as one of the 4 proprietors of the Dublin Harmonic Institution in Westmoreland Street, a grand name for selling sheet music and for hiring and selling musical instruments. He became organist of St Stephen's, the Pepper Canister Church, and was in line to be organist of St George's, Hardwick Place, somewhat more upmarket perhaps, but he was caught up in the major shenanigans over the vestry tax or cess tax, by which everyone in the parish, of all religious persuasions, had to contribute to the costs of the Church of Ireland. There was much angst about church luxuries, in particular organs, organists and organ blowers. Bunting received financial support for his St Stephen's salary from the Attorney General, a relative of the McCracken family in Belfast. Further support was offered for the St George's post, but it looks as if he never actually took up the post. I've documented the information I've gleaned about those years on my website, and Mary Louise O'Donnell has written a fine paper for Harp Ireland's Perspectives, available online. But there's still much more research needed to fill in details about Bunting's time in Dublin. Over to someone to fill out those details, maybe someone who's listening today. Harry Grindle, in his Survey of Irish Cathedrals, noted that in 1820, when Bunting had settled in Dublin, someone called Stephen White repaired the organ in St Patrick's Cathedral. Was Bunting responsible for suggesting White's employment? So many questions. In general, I've not been too involved with Bunting's own manuscripts. Much excellent work on them has or is being done by many, many people. Donal O'Sullivan, Micheál O'Sullivan, Colette Maloney, to name but a few. The manuscripts are all so much more accessible now, thanks to Queen's University in Belfast having digitised the material for online access. Peter Downey has explored the anomalies in the publication dates of Bunting's volumes, so that 1796 is really 1797. Disappointingly, not everyone seems to have caught up with that. I think I'd said about the Peter Downey having rectified the Bunting volume date from 1796 to 1797, and using that as just a an excuse to recommend always double checking and triple checking sources, because you find so many things wrong often. My earliest website, it said, was a verbatim copy of a broadcast from 1984, and I sourced George Petrie and Charlotte Milliken Fox, all the obvious ones, as it were, and that's been over the decade or so now. It's been improved and corrected. But one thing which has annoyed me, like the date for the Bunting volume 1796 to 1907, there are often wrong dates given for the three harpers' gatherings in Granard, County Longford. And indeed, there's a plaque on the Granard Market House which did or does state it to be location of the first harp festival held in Ireland, 1781. That date was repeated elsewhere and has been probably forever since, so surely it must be true. The source seems to have been the memoirs of the harper Arthur O'Neill. They're really worth reading. They're all readily available online on the Queen's University Bunting site, but O'Neill was already very old, and his memory is understandably not quite right. It was great to find the original dates, 1784, 85 and 86, all carefully reported in the Dublin press at the time. No excuse then for wrong dates. Genealogical research is often of great value, and I make use of resources such as Ancestry at a cost, and even the Mormon's Family Search website at no cost. And it was thanks through those that I got in contact with the Danish census of 1786, where I located the funder of those Granard meetings. He was John Dungan. Arthur O'Neill misremembered him as James. John ran a sugar refinery in Copenhagen and most likely owned a sugar plantation in St. Croix, one of the then Danish West Indies. Slave trade money, no doubt, but we won't go into that just now. The other thing about that plaque in Granard, and indeed the similar one in the Assembly Rooms in Belfast, is that both use the term harp festivals. They were never referred to as that in their day. Granard offered a competition for harpers along with a grand ball and supper. Very convivial affairs which, much to Dungan's disappointment, always produced the same first, second and third prize winners. They also cropped up in Belfast a few years later. Belfast described theirs as a meeting of harpers. Its first actual festival, so-called, was in 1903, when Belfast organised a harp festival to celebrate that 1792 meeting. Out of all that, I'd want to reinforce the need to never trust, always check and double check all the facts, even when they appear to be from a reliable source. Allow me to mention one pet bugbear. Alongside writing programme notes, I'm regularly asked to proof and downsize the biographies of conductors and soloists. They usually come with a little warning from the agent that they must not be edited. But all too often, they're dense, endless lists, orchestras across the world, operatic roles with maybe only a character and an opera title, no composer for the uninitiated. Then there are past and future appearances. Once you drill down into those, courtesy of Dr. Google again, so often a forthcoming event happened a few months ago, or a next season actually meant this or last season. I blame the agents. When I studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London, I was able to indulge my love for digging up obscure repertoire. First of all, at the nearby British Museum. This was in the late 1960s, before they separated off the British Library. So I was copying out rare organ music by pupils of Bach, mainly Johann Ludwig Krebs, and music from my oboe sister by the likes of Thomas Atwood Walmsley and others. But new vistas opened up when the Royal Academy librarian and her successor allowed me access to the Academy's library's basement, a treasure trove of 18th century manuscripts, which at that stage were only lightly catalogued and not fully identified. Sadly, I wasn't the one who a few years later found a Gloria there by Handel. Nor, I'm sure, would such free access be so casually granted to manuscripts today. My interest was in the many volumes of music manuscripts copied for John Christopher Pepusch, Johann Christoph Pepusch. He was one of a generation of musical immigrants to London in the earliest years of the 18th century, basically a generation before Handel. It was Pepusch who organised the house band of James Bridges, Lord Chandos. He became the Duke of Chandos a few years later. Pepusch organised the library, employed the musicians, and he also composed works for the household. Sometime in the mid-teens, Pepusch and his noble patron employed Handel as their composer in residence. The result is a set of church anthems known as the Chandos anthems. But Pepusch also wrote anthems for the household, and I spent a lot of time editing one of those anthems written for a Christmas service. There's so much material in the volumes. We performed my Pepusch anthem a couple of times in London, and then I came across all the material just a few months ago. Thought, now is the time to digitise it for wider circulation. Alas for me, he said selfishly, it has recently appeared on CD. Good news for Pepusch, of course. One of the works I came across was an organ voluntary by Pepusch in 12 movements, one of the longest such voluntaries from that period, and one of the few of his keyboard pieces to survive. I spent many hours searching manuscript collections of organ voluntaries, mainly in the Royal College of Organists, looking for similarities or versions of the same, maybe to provide additional sources. It's amazing, it's amazing how organists at that time happily swapped pieces by different composers to create new combinations. So a prelude by Pepusch or someone else was followed by an allegro by the likes of John Stanley to create a new organ voluntary. Those few finds provided additional sources for when I edited the 12-movement piece. It was effectively an opening prelude and a closing fugue with 10 character pieces in between, each designated to be played by a specific organ stop or combination of stops. That led in turn to exploring London organs of the period as to which organ it might have been written for. All good detective work. I was quite pleased with myself when the work was published by Universal Edition in Vienna. Much to my annoyance, the economics of printing being what they were and are, I suppose, they omitted all my carefully annotated notes and critical commentary detailing hours and hours of research. Thanks to the internet, I've been able to provide all that fully uncensored online. Read all about it. As an aside, Pepusch was a man of the theatre, providing the bass lines for the songs in The Beggar's Opera and its sequel Polly, the works which helped to revolutionise the world of opera at the time and upset Handel's business plans. Pepusch was also one of the founding fathers of the Academy of Vocal Music in 1726, a few years later becoming the Academy of Ancient Music. It was for the Academy's choir that Pepusch wrote a very fine motet, Beatus Vir. Do have a look at it online. It's a 4-piece setting, very finely controlled modal writing and stylistically so different from anything else by this disciple of Corelli. Well worth singing. Where am I going with this? Well, that same manuscript source for the 12-movement organ voluntary also contained a 4-movement piece entitled Hautbois Solo. Never assume, I say, but excitedly, I reckon this was an oboe sonata by Dr. Pepusch, no less. Actual oboe sonatas labelled as such are relatively rare during this period. Handel's C minor sonata is a great example, wonderful chromatic writing in the 2nd movement. I prepared an edition of my Pepusch sonata. It was duly broadcast as such by Derek Bell. These were the days before his harp playing took over. And it was played a couple of times around London as well, always accredited to Dr. Pepusch. The 2nd movement uses a theme from an aria in Act 1 of Handel's Giulio Cesare, Non è si vago. Surely that proved it was a solo sonata by Pepusch. Well, in my defence, I was unnecessarily swayed by Hawkins' general history of the science and practice of music. Quote, about the year 1722, Signora Margherita de Lepine, having quitted the stage with a large sum of money, Dr. Pepusch married her and went to reside in Boswell Court, Carey Street. Her mother also lived with them. The house where they dwelt was sufficiently noted by a parrot, which was used to be set out at the window and had been taught to sing the air Non è si vago e bello in Julius Caesar. I asked Handel scholar Winton Dean for his comments, and he pointed out that Non è si vago was indeed a very great popular hit at the time, sung in theatre intervals and found in many contemporary manuscript copies in a variety of different keys. Hence, he said, no doubt, its appearance in the repertory of Pepusch's parrot. And then I came across William Babel's 2 volumes, each of 12 sonatas or solos for the violin or hautboy, or German flute, added to the 2nd volume, with continuo. They were published in 1725, 2 years after Bebel's death. He was the leading virtuoso harpsichordist of the time, particularly renowned for his flashy versions of Handel opera arias, and a pupil of Pepusch, please note. Many of the sonatas or solos in these posthumous volumes are indeed reckoned to be mainly for the oboe because of their limited tessitura or range. They're intriguing works, and some believe that by the second volume in particular, miscellaneous movements might have been mixed together, cobbled together to create hybrid sonatas, just like those organ voluntaries. Lo and behold, my so-called Pepusch sonata corresponded to the first 3 movements of Sonata number 10, while the finale was effectively the same as the finale of number 12, both in part 2 of Bebel's solos and more likely to have been mashed together. It was all a lesson in perseverance, exploration, and not jumping to ill-founded conclusions. But do look up the Bebel Oboe Sonata on my website and the 2 lengthy PDFs of the preface. Talking of storage space, or the lack of it, I'm hoping to continue sometime with a list put online, indeed, of the details of the orchestral scores, over 150 of them, of Ulster airs, a rather misguided BBC idea from the late 1930s to preserve the heritage of Ulster folk song through short orchestrations. The critic and composer Norman Hay was invited to be the editor of the scheme, and he would commission fellow composers to make the arrangements. They were mostly men, but in due course, Joan Trimble contributed 14 Ulster airs. At the last count, the unloved and out-of-fashion scores were in brown envelopes leaning somewhat bendingly on a shelf in a warehouse space. At least they're dry, and so far safe. In the first 31 arrangements, there was just one by a woman composer. She was Ianthe Galway. In 1927, she won a composition scholarship to the Royal College of Music in London. Other scholarships in composition that year were awarded to Imogen Holst and Elizabeth McConkie. Ianthe was indeed in good company. That same intake included a trumpet scholarship for her husband-to-be, Cecil Kidd from Castlewellan in County Down. He became a renowned trumpet performer and teacher. Ianthe was a pupil of Vaughan Williams. She wrote songs, piano music, an orchestral nocturne, and a ballet suite. There may be more which I haven't identified. If you get a chance to read my webpage about her, I've traced her creative parents and her collaboration on radio plays, usually for children with her mother. Alas, some months ago, my appeal for more information and news of the whereabouts of her music brought sad news. Her granddaughter wrote to me. I'm sorry to tell you that whilst we once had a trunk full of my grandmother's writings and compositions, it no longer exists. It suffered severe water damage many years ago, and none of it was salvageable. Such a shame, as I certainly remember the ballet suite amongst them. So a sad ending indeed. Maybe there are other copies elsewhere, of course, so I await news. Thankfully, a contemporary of Ianthe Galway, and one who was also a Vaughan Williams pupil, was her mother, and her music was, I'll say it again. Thankfully, a contemporary of Ianthe Galway, and one who is also a Vaughan Williams pupil, has her music saved for posterity, thanks to it being held safely in Trinity College here in Dublin. Even better, the librarian is hugely sympathetic to ensuring its widest dissemination. Ina Boyle's music has had the benefit and campaigning support of Edith Bosang and Katie Rowan. I edited Ina Boyle's string quartet over 14 years ago, and subsequently 2 song settings for voice and string quartet or string orchestra. The Piatti string quartet has recorded the work and recently toured Ireland with it. I caught the performance in Derry. I was thrilled to hear how they'd really got inside the music, presumably after so many performances they've given of it. It ranged from the gutsy and forceful to the intensely personal and emotional. It does, I think, make it all worthwhile. Now we just need a contralto or deep mezzo to sing those 2 songs, settings of Edith Sitwell and Emily Bronte. During my radio years, and indeed to this day, the BBC was an important part of the Ulster Orchestra's funding equation. We were always looking for ways to ensure that free BBC invitation concerts didn't deter paying customers from the orchestra's own concert series. I reckon we led the way in those years with so many different threads: women composers, Berwald symphonies, Goetz, double concertos, including Ethel Smythe's concerto for violin and horn, and of course the rediscovery of Stanford, particularly all 7 of his symphonies. That provided Chandos, the recording company, with preparatory rehearsals for their pioneering recordings. In the studio, we rediscovered Sterndale Bennett's 5 piano concertos, thanks to the pianist Malcolm Binns. In the days before Sibelius, there was much use of photocopiers and creating full scores for the conductors by cutting up the piano part from the photocopied early 19th century publication, pasting the strips onto large manuscript paper and copying in the orchestral parts around that piano part. And there were at least half a dozen of Cipriani Potter's symphonies. Now, those would benefit from a new set of recordings. They're really rather good works from a neglected period. Potter met Beethoven in Vienna and showed him some of his works. The deaf Beethoven reportedly said later that Botter is a good composer. I've edited Potter's G major quartet, the only one of his several quartets that seems to have survived. It would work so well programmed alongside a Beethoven or Mozart or Haydn quartet. We just need the quartet to take it on. All of which is probably a tedious and long-winded lead-in to another composer, another neglected composer I've worked on, and that's Samuel Wesley. He was a contemporary of Mozart, well, born around 6 years later. His life was marred by long periods of depression, brought on, it's believed, by an accident which damaged his skull when he was around 21 years old. I think he fell into a building's foundation. His father was the hymn writer Charles Wesley. His uncle was John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. Despite that religious background, he was described as a pious Catholic, a raving atheist, mad, reasonable, drunk and sober, the dread of all wives and regular families, a warm friend, a bitter foe, a satirical talker, a flatterer, a blasphemer. You get the picture. There were 3 children of his marriage, and a few years later, his former housekeeper bore him several more, including the reforming church musician Samuel Sebastian Wesley. Sebastian Wesley, because his father, R. Samuel Wesley, led the way in the Bach revival in the early years of the 19th century, well before Mendelssohn's efforts. One work I edited back in the mid-1980s was his organ concerto in D. He signed it March the 22nd, 1800, and played it during the interval of Salomon's first London performance of Haydn's The Creation. Then it was a 3-movement work ending with a hornpipe, which enjoyed some popularity. That favourite hornpipe was published separately as a piano work 20 years later, so it did last. The concerto was originally scored for flutes, oboes, bassoons, horns and strings. But then comes the surprise. Wesley was invited to play it again, this time at the Tamworth Festival in 1809, at which time he was busy preparing an edition of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, published in 1810. For Tamworth, he added an additional movement to his concerto, the D major fugue from Book 1 of the 48. The organ plays it first as a solo, then is repeated with full orchestra, now complete with trumpets, bass trombone and timps. A full complement of 3 trombones were certainly added for performances of the concerto in the 1820s. The sound is indeed a riot. Forget narrow-bore trombones and historically informed performance. In 1985, it sounded just like pure Leopold Stokowski. After the performance, Wesley wrote to Benjamin Jacobs, organist of the Surrey Chapel in Southwark and very much one of his colleagues in the Bach revival, quote, "The concerto was excessively praised and the fugue of our Sebastian produced a glorious effect with the instruments. Notwithstanding, I sat at a great disadvantage, for the new choir organ completely obstructed all possibility of seeing any part of the orchestra but a violin or 2 on my right and left wing. So we were obliged to have a mirror in order that I might see Frank Kramer," he was the leader, "as it was just as well that he and I should start together, and this was managed pretty well, save and except that the necessity of hanging the glass so high proved a sad annoyance to my unfortunate neck, which was obliged to stretch till I thought I should never be able to reduce it to its common length again." Actually, I would recommend Philip Ollison's wonderful collections of all of the known letters by Samuel Wesley. They're fabulous reading. Over the past few years, I've been working on Wesley's 1811 piece, the trio for 3 grand piano fortes, and that's piano fortes with an apostrophe, no less. I think it's a winner. It certainly owes something to his Bach studies. We broadcast it as part of a live Radio 3 lunchtime recital many years ago with the McAuliffe Inanga piano duo and Martin Roscoe. My edition of the trio is based on an autograph score in the British Library, signed S.W. and dated 20th of April 1811. It's a wonderful oblong volume, also containing his duet, Wesley's duet for the Grand Piano Forte, June 1791, his duet for the organ, May 1812, his introduction for a duet arrangement which then follows of Bach's St. Anne Fugue, 1814, and his handwritten copy of Bach's Goldberg Variations, quite a collection. The problem is that Wesley mislaid his original score of the trio in 1814 and had to copy out a new one. It appears that each performer in those days played from a full score, though separate parts do also exist. Bit of a mystery. Is this British Library score the recopied score? Half as nicely well formed and tidy like a final copy, and then halfway through it becomes very rushed indeed, a hurried scribble and much more scrawly. He wrote to his friend Vincent Novello on the 1st of July that year, "I have not yet been successful in discovering the whereabout of the original score of the trio, but shall not give over search in hope of getting it by Sunday. Meanwhile, there can be no violent immorality in your just inquiring from me of Samuel Webb whether he may not possibly have it among his manuscripts. I am pretty sure he wished for a copy, which it was not likely that I would refuse. Put the worst to the worst, there is no impossibility of making a third copy from either yours or Stokes." He was one of the pianists, obviously. "And though this cannot be accomplished by Sunday, unless one of us could afford time to do nothing else, yet we may make something of a shift to get a sort of practice of it by peeping over each other's books. At all events, let us meet as intended at 5. So clearly they were still paying from their full scores. 20 days later, Wesley wrote again, "I've completed the transcript of the trio, and therefore now the only remaining point is the settlement of a time for performing it in worshipful society." Oh yes, and he also added a note, "Salomon is much agog to be among us. I would strain a point to accommodate him as to time. Clementi has promised to come. The Crammers I shall invite, although of J.B. Crammer I have no hope." 2 years later, he was writing to Novello again, "As you did not call according with your intention of Friday, I take the first opportunity of informing you that we mean to have our trio on Saturday next at noon in Kirkman's room. Stokes cannot be won, as he pleads particular business on the score of some score which he is to get a little money by, but Joey Major is studying his part, and I think will be able to do it justice. I've managed to get rid of half my scholars on Friday on purpose so we may have a rehearsal in the evening at Kirkman's. P.S. Clementi tells me he shall strain a point to come, saying, handsomely enough, that whenever he's heard a good thing once, he likes to hear it twice, and the 3 times are better, and so on in proportion. I've invited Kalkbrenner. Crammer, of course, is too grand for us. We must be contented with the attention of Clementi, his masters." So very much pianists celebrating pianists. Alongside that original manuscript score, the British Library also has a later copy in the handwriting of the son, Samuel Sebastian Wesley. And then a colleague in England, back again to Philip Olson, the Wesley scholar, wrote to say that Sotheby's had sold another autographed manuscript score of the trio in 1978. It was now in private hands. Fortunately, I was able to track down the owner, who made an excellent photocopy and kindly posted it to me. It had been the property of the Dublin-born composer, conductor and violinist W.H. Cairns, who went to London to work from 1817 onwards. The question arises, of course, as to where did Cairns obtain it? Was this the missing copy, perhaps borrowed by Samuel Webb? A note in the score states, "The original score given to me by the author, my esteemed friend S. Wesley, 1811. So now, along with 2 apparently autographed manuscript scores, plus a later 3rd copy by Wesley's son, as I mentioned, there are also single piano parts, most of them autographed, plus a complete 3rd piano part in Samuel Sebastian Wesley's hand, and another with a few pages copied by Samuel Wesley's daughter Eliza. And they're also somewhat separated out into different sections. So the problem when faced with so many bits and pieces is not so much in realizing a final edition, but the time-consuming task of recording every last detail in the critical commentary to accompany the edition, it just needs a free few weeks to complete. It's important to emphasise the importance of Wesley's surviving letters and the newspaper mentions to track down the known performances in Wesley's lifetime. There are at least 5 that have been covered to date. An 1813 planned performance in the Argyll Rooms was withdrawn for obvious reasons. I find that it would be very incommodious to perform the pianoforte trio. The orchestra, meaning the platform, at the Argyll Rooms cannot contain 3 of these instruments without extreme inconvenience, especially since the organ will occupy so much of the space. Let me end with a few minutes on the composer. What time are we doing? Oh dear. Yes, let me end with a couple of minutes on the composer Edward Norman Hay. I made a radio series on him back in the 1980s when his widow and 2 sons were all still alive. He was born in Kent, where his father from Coleraine was a customs officer working in Kent at the time. His Scottish-born mother died when Norman was 2. His father then arranged for a transfer back to Coleraine, where Norman was brought up by his aunts, the sisters of his father. Baby Norman had contracted polio when he was just 9 months old. He was unable to walk until he was 12. He had a permanent limp thereafter. In later life, he complained about being brought up in a country town with no music to be heard except at the parish church and the Coleraine Musical Society's performances of Messiah, Elijah, and the Creation. To cut a long story short, he had some of the best teachers around, including some lessons from Eaglefield Hull, perhaps by post. Hull was a Scriabin and Cyril Scott expert, and also the founder of the British Music Society, the BMS. On the one hand, I'm campaigning for Norman Hay's achievements to be recognised by a blue plaque. On the other hand, I've long talked about writing a book on him. The difficulties arise as to how to structure that. I'm currently tracking down his earliest years to identify the first teachers he had. He did play violin, cello, and piano, and his early works included success at Feis Ceoil. Just a few weeks ago, I found a lengthy interview with him in the Dublin Leader by Ethna Ní Fhadar. Who's she? I'm grateful to Michael Dervin for demonstrating that that was a pseudonym used by Dr. Annie Wilson Patterson from Cork. There's an additional footnote in the second edition of her 6 original Gaelic songs, signed similarly Ethna Ní Fhadar, but followed by AWP in brackets. The Annie Patterson interview followed success, as I said, at the Feis Ceoil, when Stanford awarded Hay the Composition Prize for his cello sonata. Where is that now? Claire Matthew and Havok Nelson played it together, possibly as late as the 1960s, but no one can find it now. Here's hoping it comes to light. Amassing the information is one thing, but Hay's criticisms and his weekly music columns in the Belfast Telegraph under the pseudonym of Rath Call also deserve inclusion. He was trenchant in his writings, with many attacks on the BBC, one of the hands that fed him, about standards, musical balances in broadcasting, the lack of a civic orchestra, choral standards, music and education, his assessment of visiting artists, his deploring John Cormack's choice of programmes. It makes for a great read. So what I want to do, ideally, is somehow find a way of piecing in chunks of those criticisms in amongst both his life, his musical achievements, and everything else. There's a real challenge in there. Anyway, I probably better end there. But there's so many corners of the repertoire still to find out and explore. I would encourage musicologists everywhere to get looking almost at the local level. Thank you very much.